My name is Rahul Oka. I'm an economic anthropologist. I'm originally from India. I've lived in many different parts of the world, but I did my formal schooling, like a post secondary schooling in the US, and I was trained as an archeologist. And my work focused on the collapse of trading ports in the Indian Ocean between 1500 to 1800. Now you may ask, how did I then get into the refugee stuff? Because I still do archaeology as something, but then basically what happened was that I was interested in figuring out how people do trade and exchange in dangerous areas or dangerous situations. And so I started to go into northern Kenya to figure out how people do trade over there. And there I basically hopped onto Somali trucks that were going from Western Kenya, this town called Kitale, all the way to Sudan and South Sudan in the trucking routes. And so I went in the trucking routes and I ended up in Kakuma refugee camp, where I basically found a little city, a microcosm of reality of urban life, but a relief dependent city that was still hacking out some kind of agency and structure for its own self out of that desert landscape. And then when I saw that, I said, okay, well, I can keep on going, doing my work in, looking at trade under different circumstances, but this is going to be a special thing, because you think of a refugee camp, and I'd never seen a refugee camp. I'd only seen them on CNN or something like that, where you have, people lining up for food and so on and so forth. And on the first day I went in with a car that belonged to one of the camp store owners. And we went to this amazing Ethiopian restaurant, had delicious food, and then went to this place that was called Sarafina's, the world under one roof, which is like a little department store. And you can get anything from a full bridal furniture set to everything in the refugee camp. And that's when I actually said, okay, so we have devised this way to try and manage hundreds of thousands of people who have been displaced forcibly across international borders. But what has happened is that, we provide them the basic level of survival. And when I say we, I mean the donor nations and so on and so forth. So basically the American people, the people of Europe, the people of Japan, most of the major donor nations. But on top of that, they then use those things very agentively to hack out lives for themselves, lives that give them a little bit of normalcy and a little bit of dignity. Now, I continued working in Kakuma, then I added Dadaab. I also went to the refugee camps in Uganda, in Bangladesh, in Thailand, and in the Philippines, and in Serbia, where there are asylum centers. This is in 2016, 2017, when all the migrants were moving through Europe into, and Serbia was one of the way stations. I worked with the Serbian government over there. On the same hand, because the Kakuma refugee camp is on the verge of just collapse, and the Kenyan government is taking over, but they don't have the money to do it. There's a lot of violence and everything. Trying to put a project in there about accompaniment and about, can things be done at a local level without expecting foreign aid, because that era is gone. In the post-USAID context, that's my Kenya work. So that's in a nutshell.
Oh yeah. We can focus a little bit on Kakuma refugee camp. We have been talking about it before in this program and so forth, and we know some people there as well, because they are also fleeing into Sweden. Nuba people are coming here, so we know something about it. But our viewers may not know so much about it. So you can first tell us about Kakuma. What is Kakuma, and what are your impressions about this particular place in Africa, really?
Okay. So Kakuma, back in 2007-8, when I first got there, was this vast camp distributed across 4 locations. And Kakuma Camp 1, 2, 3, 4, and each of them was basically based on the age in which it had been settled. So the Camp 1 was settled in 91, 92, and was primarily South Sudanese. This were the people who were driven out by the resurgence of the conflict between 85 to and then the ongoing conflict in the 90s. So before that, there were camps near the Ethiopian border, Liboye. There were also camps in other parts of Kenya. So then, when they decided to build this one in Kakuma, so it's about 90 kilometers away from the border in Nadapal from South Sudan. And it is on the main A1 highway that connects, basically, that goes from Cairo all the way down down to Cape Town. And so it essentially passes along that particular. So it's a trucking route. Back in the 1960s, Kakuma, there's a town over there. It's a sub-county capital, and the town there was primarily pastoralists and some Somali traders who came there in the 1960s. These three young men, who then established these a series of businesses that are linked along Somali trader diaspora networks that went all the way into Juba, Rumbek, Capoeira, other parts of South Sudan, and connected them to Kenya. So when I got there in 2007, it was like the nephews or the children of these three first traders who were still operating these large wholesales. And the reason why the UN decided to put the camp over there was because these three traders were there. So there was some logistical supply infrastructure already present, and Kakuma was a decent enough small town. But of course, the town itself was only 40,000 people. The camp quickly went from a few thousand to, when I came, so before 2005, the camp was about 125 to 150,000. Mainly South Sudanese, and quite a lot of Somalis who, in 1997, there was a camp on the coast of the Kenyan coast called Utanga Benadiri, and that's where most of the Somalis had been settled. So then after that camp was shut down on the coast, they were either sent to Dadaab refugee camp, which is on the border with Somalia, or many of them were essentially sent off to Kakuma. Now, when the Somalis came in, they injected a tremendous amount of entrepreneurial vibe into the camp, because South Sudanese were primarily pastoralists, and even though they existed in large diasporan communities across the world and they would get some remittances here and there, they mainly had these small shops that were like primarily retail. The Somalis then came in, and then between the Somalis who were already there and the new incoming Somalis, they changed the economic nature of the camp, where you had the relief economy, of course, and on top of that, you had a multi-million-dollar economy that even in 2007, when I got there, the camp was only about 60,000 people, because a lot of the Sudanese had left to go to South Sudan after the peace accords. There was a commercial economy, and even at that time, it was a $25 million a year commercial economy that was just pure the refugees and the host community. That was them. The relief, they would buy food from the relief industry and sell it in the black market, but that is a very small portion of what they were actually doing. Then when the Somali situation became really bad in 2009, 2010, after the Union of Islamic Courts was deposed, and then Al-Shabaab, the Al-Shabaab networks took over, and then the violence started happening in Somalia, and then in 2011 famine. I was there. The camp population suddenly went up, now filled with Somalis. So it went up to about 110, 120,000 people. Already by about 2013, 2014. So when we did the World Bank project, so it was around this time that Rauf Mazou, who was the UNHCR rep for Kenya at that time, now he's the director of operations, the deputy director of operations in Geneva. He read my papers, and he basically said to me, he wrote to me and he said, "We'd like to work with you because you've given us a way to approach dignity in a tangible way, that you can use the commercial economy to gain some dignity." Because what I had essentially said was that if you sell the corn and beans you get, which is corn and beans, right? You sell it into the black market and you buy tea, you buy a little bit of meat, you buy some rice or something like that, and you can have a feast, maybe with you, your family, your neighbors. You feel normal, you feel like you're back home. That normalcy gives you a sense of dignity, and that normalcy and dignity together, that complex, enables you to live for years in these horrendous circumstances without rioting, without, it's kind of it kind of brings the violence down. They liked that. So then I kept on working with them, hoping that, okay, I've been critiquing them from the outside, the UN people, but now I can maybe do some work from the inside. So Kakuma, back until 2017, actually boomed. The economy was booming. There was a lot of things actually going on. I mean, there was an entire, I mean, I have photos of a huge warehouse being built. It was a furniture showroom with an exercise like a gym, an Ethiopian coffee shop and a Somali tea shop. I mean, it was like, if you were like an urban professional looking to go to the mall, this would have been it. Right? And it was built by a Somali woman who paid $20,000 for the non-existent commercial real estate for that freeholding. It was like three or four, no, it was about 10 different house units that had been built together into one warehouse. And she took contracts for the local. So anytime, for example, the UN would have money to, they would give it to the Lutheran World Federation to build desks. The Lutheran World Federation would turn to Don Bosco VCT and say, have your workshops build desks. So that was a system back then.
Well, you spoke about a dignity before, that it's very important for the refugees to feel some kind of meaning with life and, feel some kind of hope and so forth. So I think that's also very important that they have some kind of project or some work or something that they believe in and so forth. Can you expand about that? What is the existential meaning of dignity and so forth?
Okay. This is actually a topic that I pondered upon because I didn't go in to study dignity, but it it came to me through conversation. So I was sitting with one of my research partners. He was a refugee, and he pointed to a Turkana man who was just sitting on the side of the road, and the man was clearly intoxicated in one way or the other, and he had his requisite stick and his stool, the Turkana stool that they use, and he basically was just sitting on the side of the road midday, intoxicated, and obviously when you're intoxicated and you're just sitting on the side of the road in the midday, your life is not going well. If I put it in a very, very, sort of like, euphemistic manner. And he said, "You see that man over there? You see somebody who's drunk and so on and so forth." And my friend says, "I see him as a man who's lost his herd. And when he lost his herd, he lost his dignity." Now, what does that mean? For a Turkana man, your social status, if you can see it as one approximation of dignity, I mean, social status is not the only meaning of dignity. Dignity is a very complex, multifaceted concept that every culture in the world vaguely has an idea about, but when we ask to pin it down, it's hard for us to pin it down because it goes across contexts, classes, and everything like that. You can have somebody who's extremely wealthy and has a high status behaving completely without dignity, or completely, and then you can have somebody who's poor but who carries themselves with a way that people will be like, okay. And so 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 he explained, because my research partner was also from a pastoralist community. He said, your herd is basically how your worth in society is produced, right? Your herd is how you essentially get the ability to get married. Your herd is the ability to have children and to basically grow as a person. Now, ethnographically and historically and archaeologically, we know that herding in that part of the world, the the specific role of herding as one of the sole grantors of social status among Turkana societies, a very recent phenomenon. It's like 100 years old. They had much more diversified economy, but then the British came in. They basically put them into these closed, confined spaces, these closed districts, and basically made life very hard for them. So now herding is one of the few ways that they can actually gain dignity. And for the rest of the community of Kenya, they see the Turkana as barbaric, and they see them as backward and anachronistic. And so the Turkana have a word for dignity, which is arimatoi, and they also have a word for indignity, which is ngimeni. The same thing in Kiswahili, which is a generic word that was used. Um, Heshima means dignity, and Madarao means indignity. And as I started to delve more deeply into the idea of indignity, I realized that it might actually be easier to understand what is indignity, and that thereby get through dignity rather than just focus on dignity, because we can go in different meanings. I mean, dignity can mean honor, it can mean respect, it can mean so many different things. But indignity is basically, sort of like how you treat people, right? I mean, you can treat people with indifference and the indifference of indignity, or the indignity of indifference, or you can treat people badly or cruelly, which is also, in order to humiliate them. So when we think in terms of refugee dignity, right, their ability to engage in acts that are agentive, or sort of like in acts that they themselves can and will do, that they have the little power to do, that actually brings them dignity, right? Because the indignity lies in the supplication, in sitting, waiting, and waiting for somebody to come and take pity on you. They don't want pity. They want their own. They want a sense of their own accomplishment, their own life, and so on and so forth. And together that gives dignity. And that doesn't solely mean through work, although good, meaningful work, like the ones that they used to do when they were back home, would essentially go a long way towards helping build a dignity. And that was one of the things that was in the plans for the UN and so on and so forth when they were doing the comprehensive refugee response framework, that engaging in community, building local communities, building local neighborhoods, and so on and so forth, when people can not only engage in the work but engage with each other, that would essentially build lives of dignity, even though these lives might not be wealthy, and so on and so forth. So dignity was a major part of what the UN was actually trying to do, excepting that they decided to do it they decide to execute a completely new paradigm based on things that were being done before and that had not worked, right? And that was the biggest problem that we actually encountered. You can shift food to vouchers. If you can shift from the food ration to the voucher, and so now people can actually go and buy the stuff that they want, excepting that you say, oh, you can't buy this and you can't buy that. The distrust actually creates indignity, right? I mean, when you don't trust somebody, you don't treat them in a dignified manner, and when they've done nothing to earn their distrust. But of course, for the organizations, and I'm not just telling you that the organizations were all wrong. I mean, this is an age-old thing that basically the poor are seen as undeserving, and hence any charity given to the poor is always calculated in terms of, are you deserving or undeserving? Right? And if you're a poor person who's trying to get ahead in this way or the other, you'll be seen as undeserving. So you have to do something in order to earn the charity. You can't just sit there and just take it. But then if you do something, you're seen as undeserving, and like, so sorry, not for you. So refugees fell into the same problem. And so one of the biggest problems was that the despite this not being the intention of any of the organizations, or so on and so forth, you had multiple pathways by which there were indignity between created for the refugees. So first of all, you have the gatekeepers, or the security guards or local staff, who basically their job was to keep the refugees away from the international staff in these organizations. And the international staff very rarely came to know of some of the ways that the local staff would essentially deal with the refugees, which was remarkably undignified in ways. It's like, insults and this was not the norm, but and it was also understandable in the sense that the Kakuma is a harsh environment. Temperatures in this particular place, like ground temperature at 2 o'clock in the afternoon can go to 50 degrees Celsius, which means that most crops that you're going to plant are going to die. And yet what you do is that you essentially tell people, here, plant these home gardens, plant all of these particular activities, And when it dies, then people are kind of blamed for the failure, right? I mean, this was the people from the Danish Refugee Council in Dadaab who actually who were telling me this, that they did the study on this, and they found that the agriculture was not viable. But that's because something that the donors would like to fund in the hopes of making them self-sufficient, you're going to practice it where it's not viable. And then when it fails, then you can turn around and blame the people for the failure, right? So, and this was not any one organization doing anything malevolent or anything like that. What I found in 20 plus years of working in this landscape were good people, generally well-intentioned people, people who are, and this is, you can quote me on this, you can quote me on this. For years and years, we gave all of these people band-aids and first aid kits and told them to cure cancers. And when they couldn't, we blamed them. And then finally, the mismatch between the resources given and the needs, and the needs, the unmet gaps in the needs, led to people sort of blaming the UN and all the organizations for the failure when they never had the resources to actually accomplish what they could, what they might have accomplished. And especially in the past 10 years, they had to deal with consistent depleting or flattening budgets, but the needs kept on increasing. And then, of course, last year, little more than a year ago, the whole, sort of like, the ground was just pulled out from underneath the entire global aid world, when initially it was like, oh, it's all inefficient, they can't do anything, and so on and so forth. And then the narrative became, oh, it's not actually our fault. Like, it's not our job. We have enough troubles, and so on and so forth. But of course, and that's when the indignity comes back roaring in.
Uh, Given this information, can you actually share some insights about how we could support these refugees, for example, in our organizations and people engaged in this in the issues? Really,
Okay.
have you some good insights to share with us?
Okay.
Yeah.
So for both the refugees and the local host community, I mean, like, they have a very strong sense of their own dignity, right? And that's the place you start from. That's the place you start from. The other thing is that we have to give up the assumptions that we from the outside are going to go and help anything right now, right? We have to sort of begin from a place where we don't assume that, because the big money that was there is no longer there. So I was asked the same question by a group in Cameroon about their internally displaced peoples and so on and so forth. What can we do now? And I said, unfortunately, you guys are on your own. I mean, you have to think about this as you're on your own right now. So what it is that you can actually do, and that's when, like, and when I said you're on your own, I mean, like, of course we'll be there with you, but without the much larger grants, the many more resources that we actually had prior to last year. So if we come in, we can't actually come in with those resources. So what do we do with very, very few resources, but the expertise and the intention and the willingness of people to help their fellow humans is still there, right? So those are the strengths that we have. So one of the things that we've actually been looking at closely is sort of, that faith is a very powerful thing in these areas. When you have nothing else, you have faith that keeps you going, like, that lets you wake up in the morning and put one step ahead of each other, right? Whether you believe in Allah, God, Mungu, whatever you want to you want to call your spiritual world, and so on and so forth. For a long time, the development and relief world has operated with faith being a development partner, but not a building partner. And it's not because I'm at Notre Dame, but because this actually came through a data analysis that when people participated in networks that were held together through faith and friendship, right, they were far more resilient to the fluctuations of food aid, of global geopolitics, of weather, of climate fluctuations and everything like that, than the people who did not have these faith and friendship networks. So, so one of the things that we are actually doing now, remember that all the insights that I had were for a world that no longer exists. So now we're trying to scramble to figure out what do you do in the world that is going to come, and can we get ahead of the situation by creating maybe good best practices that are locally feasible and locally dependent, right? That if you build a project where you're expecting energy and resource from outside, that can be turned off with a tweet. You cannot be dependent on that, because ultimately then your projects will die. Plus, all those things are based on funding cycles and the needs of the donors and everything like that. Now, you go with the fact that humans have actually managed to survive without things for for at least 200, 300,000 years, if you call anatomically modern Homo sapiens. In the and in that and during that particular time, they built different kinds of resilience. So now what they have on the ground is a tremendous amounts of absorptive resilience, which is that you can take what comes to you and you can survive in that particular way, but you're not going to move up. How do you move from absorptive resilience to adaptive resilience, in which you're adapting yourself and your world to each other to build something better, right? And for that, what we are trying to do is we are essentially trying to, I mean, this is an idea that we are actually writing a grant for, and then hopefully we can actually move ahead with that. But there's some good anecdotal evidence that this actually works in different places. So whether you call it subsume it under the Christian idea of accompaniment or the Catholic idea of accompaniment, where you walk together with the people, right? You're not the outsider who's behind the walls of a UN compound, inside the walls of a UN compound, tossing aid outside the wall and separate from them, but you're with the people. The Turkana have two terms for work, and one is called etic, ETIC, which is to work for somebody or to work under somebody. And the other word is akingaraken, which is to work with somebody, to work together, to walk together, to move together. We have been developing this idea with the local community for a long time. And we started talking about this idea in 2022 when I asked them, just very straightforward, what would you do if the UN was no longer here? Because when I spoke with them, the big group of elders, and I said, so local people know what to do, that's what we've been told, so what would you do? And they said, if the UN would do this, and the UN should do this, and the UN should do that, and the UN should do this. And I said, that's all based on the UN. What would you do if the UN were not here? Like, why wouldn't the UN be here? Said, if the refugee camp is taken away by President Kenyatta, if the refugee camp, UN decides to move the refugee camp. I mean, there are many reasons for why a refugee camp can be moved if people are repatriated. And they were shocked and aghast because they never conceived of a time that the UN wouldn't be there. Now, on the one hand, you'd essentially call this dependency, right? And that's, in our parlance, we'd actually call it dependency. But on the other hand, I'm calling it relationality, right? You have become, yes, you look like you've become dependent, but what you have is that you built a life together with the refugees, and the UN has been a partner in this. And when they go away, you have no idea what you're going to do. This is not dependency. They'll still survive. Many will die, but it's not that the Turkana will suddenly give up and die and lie down on the ground and just lose lives of despair. So then that's when we actually started to come up with the idea of accompaniment, which sort of go in with Paulo Freire's ideas of critical consciousness and his pedagogy of the oppressed, where many people whom you think know their surroundings actually know only a limited part of the surroundings. So most of them didn't know that the UN has no power outside that camp area. That in Nairobi, the UN is subject to the whims of the government in Kenya. Same thing for any government all over the world. The UN is only as powerful as the government lets it be, right? So once we'd explained that, they wanted to know more about the broader world and how they fit in, so the nested political economies in which they were part of. And how do you teach that to them when, like there's educational barriers and so on and so forth? And that's when I was working with a Kenyan colleague, and he's somebody else who's has massive amounts of work on the refugee migrate. He's a professor of political science and peace studies at and conflict studies at Maseno University in Kenya. And back in the 90s, he was actually working with this another Brazilian intellectual, Augusto Boal, his ideas of the theater of the oppressed, right? Where through things like theater, poetry, and performance, you can bring really, really complex topics to people who will understand them without having to put them through workshops and so on and so forth. Because the first step towards people who have been marginalized, who've been, who when they sit in a like, at a development report, when it's given back to the people, they'll sit there, the PowerPoint is going on, they don't know what is happening. They want to know what's happening. When somebody comes in with a national model for, we're going to build this electricity grid over here, and they have a national labor model which doesn't work in the local area, and when the local people say actually our labor stuff doesn't work like that, because they cannot present it in a way that makes sense to the outsiders, then it becomes a fight, it becomes conflict, right? But let's say they could produce a white paper with citations, right? Saying this is our labor model. This is the amount of work done by both, like, African and outsiders, like white people, on this particular labor model. If you want to work over here, here's a compromise, right? So at that particular point, we are essentially coming to this particular idea of flipping the script and having people become the observers of their own environment, because that's when you can actually start to identify local zones of resilience. And if you can identify local zones of resilience, then you might be able to seek some resources that could come in, or resources that can be generated through the community, that would essentially rebuild a community that for the past 30 years has been really, really badly affected by this constant inflow of external resources, and that has created a particular political, economic, and socio-ecological landscape that has now collapsed. If short of reconstructing that old landscape, we now have to begin from the grounds up. We have to build the foundations, and the foundations is people. And after all those years, I mean, I don't have anything more pithy. I don't have big magic wand solutions. It's like people to people, community building, neighborhood building, get the distrust out between people, and the only way you can do that is by having people work together, but having people understand each other's problems together. If a Somali play can be translated into Turkana and acted out by the Turkana, that means that the problems of the Somali people and the problems of the Turkana people will be understood by each other, and there's actually room to grow. Now, I'm not suggesting that this is going to be all happy, happy, joy, joy. We're going to hold hands and sing Kumbaya. Humans are far too complex, and the range of behavior is far too varied. However, we can actually build on the fact that most of our good society has been built on that. I mean, when you look at the strides made by Scandinavian societies, especially after the 19th century, I mean, Sweden, agricultural policies led to huge outmigrations out of Sweden. I mean, like in there. But then what happened afterwards, right? I mean, the idea of community, of moving together, of all of these things that the rest of us look at Scandinavian society, and we see a society that is civic minded, that is actually built around saying, let's not destroy the environment, let's actually do these things, let's do. I mean, it's not perfect, of course. I mean, but something like that in a society that has been torn apart by the 20th century, right? And by colonialism, and then the ravages of the 20th century and everything like that. Because if humans can't build on each other, we could build the most massive infrastructure possible, and it will just be an empty shell. And that's what I was actually trying to tell USAID. You can build a multi-million-dollar infrastructure, but at the end, if the people cannot respond to it, you're still going to have the same problems over and over. So it's not a magic wand. It's a long marathon towards rebuilding a civic society. But I'm like, we came this far. We can't give up now. And I'll stop there.